picture a wooden ship. And I don't mean like a modern steel-hulled cruise liner with computerized stabilizers and, satellite weather tracking.
Right, nothing like that.
Yeah, we're talking about an ancient 7th century Arab sailing vessel. It is miles offshore. The sky has just turned this bruised, violent purple, and the ocean is rising into a sheer wall of water.
Sounds terrifying, honestly.
Oh, absolutely. But here's the thing. The crew isn't panicking. They aren't throwing their hands up in surrender, just preparing to drown.
Which is what you'd expect, right?
Exactly.
Yeah.
Instead, they're relying entirely on a massive, incredibly heavy stone sitting dead center in the bottom of the hull.
Oh, wow. Just a giant rock.
Just a giant rock. And in the nautical terminology of that specific time and place, placing that specific stabilizing stone in the ship was known as Sabr.
Sabr, okay.
Yeah, it acted as ballast. It kept the vessel perfectly balanced, anchored right in the center of gravity. It made the ship completely unshakable, even when the storm was doing everything in its power to tear the timber apart.
You're pulling that straight from Allama Parwez's lecture on the closing verses of Surah Ghafir. And I just think it is the perfect place to start.
Right. It completely changes the visual.
It really does, because when you introduce that physical maritime image, it shatters the way most people understand the concept of patience.
Yeah, totally.
If you look at standard translations of Arabic text into English, Sabr is almost universally framed as a passive, defeated kind of spiritual endurance.
Like just sitting quietly with your hands folded.
Exactly. It's taking the hits, waiting for the storm to pass, and resigning yourself to your fate because you simply have no other options.
I mean, I always pictured it as the ultimate expression of helplessness. Like, I have no power to change my situation, so I'll just be patient.
Right. The traditional, very passive reading.
But going through these source notes, this sociological reading completely dismantles that framing.
It really does.
Parwez is looking at a text that historically describes a small, highly marginalized religious group facing overwhelming opposition.
Mm-hmm.
But he isn't reading it as a story about helpless people passively waiting for a miracle.
No, not at all.
He's identifying a highly calculated, revolutionary movement operating on a strict socioeconomic formula.
And to understand that formula, we have to step entirely outside the realm of theology. We have to move into the realm of sociology.
Into the actual structural laws of human societies.
Exactly. According to Parwez's analysis, those early believers didn't stand their ground against a massively powerful state apparatus out of blind, unthinking obedience.
They weren't just crossing their fingers.
No, they stood their ground because they had Sabr. And in this context, that means they possessed the intellectual and structural ballast of rational conviction.
So they had that heavy stone in the hull.
Right. They weren't just hoping they were right. They had calculated the center of gravity.
But, I mean, how do you get that level of certainty? I'm trying to put myself in the shoes of someone in that historical moment.
It's a tough position to be in.
Yeah, you are facing an opposition that has the wealth, the established state power, the sheer numbers. If your ballast is just, I believe very strongly, well, that stone is going to crack under the pressure of a state military.
That is where Parwez introduces a radical redefinition of a second concept.
Yeah.
And this pairs directly with this active version of Sabr.
Okay, what's the concept?
The word is haq. Normally, you see this translated simply as truth.
Right, truth.
And the problem with the English word truth is that it often feels so ethereal. It's like a philosophical debate you might have in a coffee shop.
It's abstract morality.
Yeah, exactly.
It's subjective, too, like
Right.
my truth versus your truth.
Which is exactly the opposite of what this movement was dealing with. In the linguistic and structural framework Parwez is using here, haq is treated much more like a scientific mechanism.
Like a literal formula.
Yes. A theory or a claim only achieves the status of haq when it produces tangible, concrete, visible results in the real world.
Oh, I see.
It is the transition from a hypothesis on paper to a tested reality.
The analogy in the source material really drives this home, I think. It's the idea of a chemistry lab.
I love that analogy.
Right, because you can write a formula on a chalkboard. You can debate the math all day long. But it remains just a claim right up until the moment you walk into the lab.
Until you actually mix the chemicals in the test tube.
Exactly. You mix them and you produce the exact physical reaction the formula predicted. At that exact moment of physical manifestation, the claim becomes haq.
It becomes undeniable reality.
So applying that to this historical movement, they aren't holding their ground hoping for magic. They are holding their ground because they understand the mechanical inputs and outputs of the social formula they possess.
And you, as a listener, have to consider the psychological shift that creates.
It's massive.
If you were operating a social movement with the cold, calculated certainty of a scientist waiting for a chemical reaction to complete, your endurance looks very different.
You don't burn out when the opposition pushes back.
Right, because you know the formula is actively working. You know the reaction is happening.
I want to push back on that, though. I mean, I understand the lab analogy,
Sure.
but if we look at the reality of being a marginalized group being crushed by a vastly superior empire, you want that lab experiment to yield results immediately.
Of course you do. Human suffering is immediate.
Right. If your family is suffering, if you're being actively oppressed, knowing you have the correct formula doesn't stop the pain today.
No, it doesn't.
So why wouldn't a system that claims to be aligned with the ultimate divine order just fast-track the results? Like, why the wait?
Well, that frustration is the crux of the entire passage Parwes is analyzing. The text addresses that human desperation head-on
How does it do that?
by stripping away any expectation of the supernatural. The core argument extracted here is that the divine order, the ultimate law governing the universe, operates exclusively through human sociology.
So it never bypasses the rules.
Never. It never bypasses the physical laws of cause and effect to fix human societies.
So there are no lightning bolts coming from the sky to smite the unjust empire.
None.
There's no magical earthquake that's going to swallow the oppressive army, no matter how intensely a group prays for it.
Exactly. And I realize how profoundly challenging that concept is for anyone accustomed to traditional religious narratives.
Oh, for sure. People want the fail-safe.
Right, where divine intervention is the ultimate fail-safe. But the text argues that the universe has unchangeable, calculated laws.
Just as gravity dictates the physical world.
Yes, socioeconomic laws dictate human society.
The source material uses an agricultural analogy to explain this, and I just found it incredibly stark.
It really paints a picture.
It asks you to imagine a farmer. His crops have failed, his family is literally starving, and his children are crying from hunger.
Just a completely desperate situation.
Utterly desperate, so he goes out into his newly planted field, drops to his knees, and weeps.
He's doing everything he can emotionally.
Yeah, he begs the universe for the wheat to grow overnight.
Yeah.
And he has all the emotional justification in the world, the deepest sincerity, the most desperate need imaginable.
But the wheat does not care.
It doesn't care at all.
Because the biology of the wheat seed is completely indifferent to the farmer's tears.
The wheat takes 6 months to grow. Period.
It's a hard truth.
It really is. The biological law governing the germination of that seed operates on a calculated, unchangeable timeline. You just can't cry it into growing faster.
You can't.
Parwes is arguing that, according to the Quranic framework he's analyzing, societal change follows this exact same rigid, rational timeline.
It's a sociological gestation period.
Yes. You cannot speed up the collapse of an unjust system or the rise of a just one through wishing or even through absolute moral purity.
You have to put in the time and the physical labor required by the sociological laws.
It demands human agency.
It does. The divine order restricts its own intervention. And there is a striking piece of imagery Parwes highlights for the text to explain this limitation.
Oh, the arrow metaphor.
Yes. The arrow of destiny is in the quiver, but it requires a human bow to be fired.
That's such a powerful visual.
I really want to linger on that metaphor because it is the fulcrum of this entire sociological argument.
Okay, let's unpack it.
The arrows represent the inevitable consequences of a rotting system. They are the natural laws dictating that injustice will eventually destroy itself.
Right, so the consequences are already loaded.
Exactly. But those arrows are completely inert in the quiver. They do not magically float out and strike the target on their own.
They need a catalyst.
They require a human agent, a structured movement of people to act as the bow.
That concept completely shifts the burden of responsibility, doesn't
It
it?
changes everything.
The implication is that the laws are set, the consequences are mathematically guaranteed by the universe, but the physical execution of those consequences requires human hands.
Human hands doing the actual physical work.
Right. If a new equitable system is going to be built, human beings have to physically, methodically dismantle the old oppressive structure.
And then construct the new one, brick by brick. There is no shortcut.
You have to operate entirely within the boundaries of physical reality.
Exactly.
But, okay, let's look at the targets those arrows are supposed to be hitting.
The empires themselves.
Yeah. If building a just society requires human hands following these slow structural laws, why do existing power structures inevitably fail?
Because they look so strong from the outside.
They really do. When I look at history, whether it's the Roman Empire, the ancient Persian dynasties, or even massive modern socioeconomic superpowers today, they look absolutely invincible.
They project invincibility.
They possess incomprehensible wealth. They have advanced science and technology. They have overwhelming military power.
To a peasant living under Rome in the year 50, that empire didn't look like it was following a mathematical formula of collapse.
Not at all. It looked permanent.
They always look permanent from the outside. But Parwez extract a critique of these systems that reveals a fatal, unavoidable structural flaw.
A flaw in the architecture itself.
Precisely. The text defines this flaw using the premise that the seed of destruction is built directly into the architecture of the system. Think of a towering, magnificent skyscraper.
Okay, I'm picturing it.
The people running the empire are spending all their time, energy, and resources decorating the penthouse.
Right, they're putting in gold fixtures, importing marble.
Admiring the view from the top and just congratulating themselves on their immense wealth and stability.
Meanwhile, the foundation down in the basement is actively rotting away.
Exactly. But because the ruling class is entirely focused on the top floor, they are completely blind to the structural decay happening at the base.
So what actually causes that rot? Like structurally?
To understand why that rot happens, we have to look at how the text identifies the root cause. It uses the term secularism, but I need to offer a massive caveat here.
Yeah, we need to be careful with that word.
This has nothing to do with the modern political definition of secularism.
Right. We aren't talking about the separation of church and state.
Exactly. We aren't talking about whether a government funds a national church or allows freedom of religion. This is a highly specific, structural definition.
So how does the text define it?
In this framework, secularism is defined as a purely materialist socio-economic system that is utterly devoid of absolute human values.
Devoid of values.
Right. And the Arabic term used for these absolute values is aqdar.
Aqdar.
Yes. In a system completely lacking aqdar, every single decision, whether economic, political, or social, is made based purely on short-term utility.
So just immediate profit and the preservation of power.
Exactly. Utility over everything else.
The source notes gave an analogy of an animal that makes this very easy to visualize.
Oh, the ox analogy, it's perfect.
Yeah, so if a hungry ox escapes its pen and wanders into a village, it doesn't look at a field of wheat and think, this field belongs to the poor widow down the street. I really shouldn't eat it.
Right. The ox doesn't have an internal moral compass regarding property rights.
Or empathy. It just sees calories. It sees pure utility.
It eats whatever crop is in front of it to satisfy its immediate physical need.
Because an animal lacks aqdar.
Exactly. It lacks an absolute value system that supersedes its immediate desires.
So how does that apply to an empire?
The critique Parwez is drawing out is that when a massive empire or a global economic system operates strictly on material utility and profit maximization, it behaves exactly like that ox.
It just consumes.
It consumes whatever is in front of it, whether that's natural resources, the labor of the working class, or weaker neighboring nations.
And it does all of this without any internal mechanism of restraint based on absolute human dignity.
It's a machine built purely for extraction.
And you might look at that machine, look at the GDP it produces, and think it is the pinnacle of human achievement.
Because the penthouse looks great.
Right. But the text is arguing that this hyper-efficiency and extraction is exactly what rots the foundation.
A system based entirely on exploitation creates a mathematical inevitability of collapse.
It's just a matter of time.
Because the people at the bottom, the foundation, are being drained of their resources, their labor, and their dignity just to decorate the penthouse.
And eventually, the foundation can no longer bear the weight of the structure above it.
The collapse is completely self-inflicted. The ruling class builds the very mechanism that will destroy them.
This ties perfectly back to the arrow and the bow concept we talked about earlier.
Oh, so?
Well, the oppressive system is already destroying itself. It's already rotting its own foundation.
Oh, I see what you mean.
A revolutionary movement doesn't actually need superior military might to take down the empire. The movement just acts as an accelerant.
They are the bow.
Exactly. By applying pressure to a structure that is already fundamentally unsound, they take a process of decay that might have taken centuries and compress it into decades, or even days.
It really forces us to reevaluate how we measure power.
It does. We tend to measure the strength of a society by its military budget, its technological advancements, the heights of its skyscrapers.
But Parwez's reading argues that those things are just penthouse decorations.
Purely cosmetic.
If the system relies on hypocrisy, injustice, and the commodification of human beings to maintain that wealth, it is structurally doomed.
The consequence isn't an arbitrary judgment handed down from the sky.
No, it's the building collapsing under the laws of physics because the foundation was eaten away.
So, if the text completely dismantles the architecture of these exploitative systems, what does it offer as the alternative?
That's the big question.
Because it's easy to point at a building and say it's going to fall down. It is much harder to provide a blueprint for a building that actually stands.
Very true. The positive model presented in the source hinges on redefining what failure actually looks like.
Redefining failure.
Yes. To understand the blueprint of the alternative structure, we first have to understand what the text defines as ultimate systemic failure, or azab.
Right. Azab. Traditionally, that is translated as divine punishment, isn't it?
Almost always. People visualize it as physical destruction. A city burning, losing a war, a massive economic crash.
But losing a war or facing a recession is just a historical fluctuation. Nations lose money all the time.
Exactly. The sociological translation Parwez uses completely flips the definition.
So what is the real azab?
The text argues that true systemic failure, the real azab, is not the loss of wealth or temporary military defeat. The true measure of a society's collapse is the degradation of human dignity.
Wow. The degradation of human dignity is the failure.
Yes. So a rational alternative system must therefore be built entirely around the absolute inviolability of human respect.
Okay, I follow that.
If the old system was the ox eating whatever it wanted based on utility, the new system is built on Oktar.
Absolute values.
Absolute values where the dignity of a single human being is the highest law, a law that supersedes any economic or political utility.
The source material gives a brilliantly specific historical anecdote to illustrate exactly what this looks like in practice.
Oh, the story of the governor.
Yes, and it's honestly hard to imagine happening today. It details an Egyptian governor operating under this newly established, value-driven system.
And he was powerful.
Oh, very. He was a high-ranking official holding immense administrative power over a massive population. But one day, in a moment of frustration or anger, he accidentally insults a common citizen.
He just snaps at them.
Yeah, he speaks to this person in a way that degrades them.
Well, in the empires of Rome or Persia that we just discussed, a governor insulting a peasant wouldn't even register as an event.
Right. The peasant is the foundation. The governor is the penthouse.
The entire system is designed to facilitate that dynamic.
But under this new structural formula, the governor's reaction is immediate and extreme.
He doesn't just hire a PR firm.
No. He doesn't issue a press release saying, "I'm sorry if anyone was offended." He doesn't go on an apology tour to save his political career.
He resigned.
He immediately drafts his resignation and submits it to the highest authority. And his reasoning was just profound. He stated, "I have lost the right to be called human."
That is heavy.
Right. By violating the core tenet of the system, the absolute dignity of another person, he felt he had disqualified himself from participating in the society, let alone leading it.
Think about the structural mechanics required to produce that kind of reaction.
It's completely alien to how we operate now.
It reveals the true engine of this alternative model, which is ultimate accountability.
Ultimate accountability.
In the text, this is the sociological translation of the concept of akhirat.
Akhirat, which is usually translated simply as the afterlife.
Exactly.
Right.
But Parwez frames it here not as a mystical realm, but as the principle of inescapable structural accountability within the social order itself.
I want to make sure I really grasp the gravity of that. Are we saying that a just economic and social order physically cannot exist if any human being holds absolute sovereignty?
That is the core argument.
Wow.
If a leader, a CEO, or a governor believes they are untouchable, that there is no final accountability and they can engineer their way out of the consequences of their actions, exploitation isn't just a possibility.
It's a certainty.
It is an inevitability. Human nature, when granted absolute power without accountability, will always default to the ox in the wheat field.
So the alternative model only functions because accountability is a closed loop.
It is inescapable for everyone.
All the way up to the highest authority. The leader is bound by the exact same laws of human dignity as the poorest citizen.
It's the ultimate check against the penthouse mentality.
You can't hoard resources at the top if the system structurally mandates that you are personally, inescapably accountable for the starvation at the bottom.
And this circles back to the movement we discussed at the very beginning.
With the ship and the ballast.
Right. Their Sabr, that heavy stone acting as ballast in the storm, was their absolute conviction that this structural model of accountability and human dignity was a scientifically sound formula.
They weren't fighting to swap out the rulers of the empire and take the penthouse for themselves.
No, they were fighting to implement a system that prevented absolute power from ever accumulating in human hands again.
Let me try to synthesize all these threads, because we've covered a massive paradigm shift here.
It's a lot to take in.
We started with this idea of rational conviction Sabr as the ballast. We look at the mechanism of change.
No magic, just human agency.
Right. Human agency bound by the rigid biological laws of cause and effect, like the wheat growing over 6 months.
And then we examined the structural collapse.
The collapse of exploitative systems that prioritize utility over absolute values. And we just looked at the positive blueprint built entirely on human dignity and inescapable accountability.
When you pull all of those elements together, you arrive at the ultimate sociological law presented in the text.
What's the term for it?
Sunnatullah. This translates to the unchangeable law of nature, or the unchangeable way of the divine order.
Parwez is very deliberate in emphasizing that Sunnatullah is not a theological theory that only applies to religious believers, right?
Absolutely. He argues that it is an objective, universal law of human sociology, functioning with the same cold indifference as gravity.
And to prove this point, he actively steps outside of religious texts.
He does. He cites non-religious, secular historians to show that anyone who studies the mechanics of human history objectively arrives at the exact same formula.
He leans heavily on the work of Robert Briffault, doesn't he? The author of The Making of Humanity.
Yes. Briffault was analyzing the rise and fall of massive civilizations like the Roman Empire from a purely historical, evolutionary perspective.
Yet his conclusion perfectly mirrors the Quranic argument Parwez is unpacking.
It's kind of incredible.
Briffault writes that any social system based on hypocrisy, injustice, and the exploitation of the masses for the benefit of a few will inherently destroy itself.
Those are the sheer mechanics of society.
It does not matter how brilliantly the administration is organized. It does not matter how much wealth they extract or how vast their trade networks are.
The foundation will rot.
Briffault addresses the technological and material advancements of these empires in a way that feels incredibly prescient for our time, too.
The text quotes him making a point that cuts right through our modern obsession with innovation.
Yeah, he states that even if a society advances to the point where humans can fly above the clouds or weigh the stars or travel at 100 miles an hour.
Which, for his era, was the absolute pinnacle of unimaginable speed.
Oh, totally. But none of that alters the fundamental sociological law.
You can have the most advanced technology in the universe, you can put a colony on Mars, but if your societal architecture is built on the degradation of human dignity, your collapse is already mathematically scheduled.
Briffault frames it as a cold evolutionary law of societal selection. He borrows a famous phrase, "The wages of sin is death."
But in his historical context, sin isn't a personal, private moral failing.
Right, it is structural injustice.
And death isn't divine retribution delivered by lightning.
It is the inevitable mathematical collapse of an unsustainable system.
The movement holding the Sabr understands this deeply.
They don't have to invent a way to destroy the unjust empire.
The empire is doing the work for them.
The movement simply has to maintain their structural integrity, act as the human bow to fire the arrows of consequence when the time comes, and be ready to build the new system on a foundation of absolute human dignity when the old one falls.
It completely redefines how we measure the viability of any society. We have to stop staring at the skyscrapers and start inspecting the basement.
You, as the listener, are living in a world dominated by massive, seemingly permanent economic and political structures. We've spent this time decoding an ancient structural formula for how human societies rise and inevitably fall, seeing that the laws of societal gravity are just as unchangeable as the laws of physics. So I want to leave you with a question to mull over as you look at the news today. Look at the institutions that seem invincible, wealthy, and technologically supreme. Based on the cold, calculated formula we just unpacked, well, which of these towering institutions are actually just rotting foundations, desperately decorating their penthouses, waiting for the right storm to test their ballast?